in discussing over the years the sleep of the dead and being at a lot of funerals in South Carolina, mostly Baptist, I often have the experience at pretty much every funeral where the pastor would quote from 2 Corinthians 5 that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Every funeral that used that verse quoted it that way, and that's not the way it's written. And I had a lady call me once at the church I was at in South Carolina, and she was calling looking for a new church to go to and realized that she wasn't probably looking for ours specifically, but she asked, well, what do you believe? I said, well, one of the things, as we talked about other stuff first, but was the sleep of the dead, that when you die, you're in the grave waiting the resurrection. And immediately she says to me, well, what about the verse that says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord? And I said, well, that's not really what the verse says. She goes, yes, it is. And I said, well, no. And she said, well, what Bible do you use? And I said, it doesn't matter. What Bible do you have? I said, do you have one at the house? Yes. I said, go get it. So she got it. We opened to 2 Corinthians 5, and I said, read that verse to me. And she said, to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. And she went, huh. I got a lot of huhs that day. So this particular passage, 2 Corinthians 5, is one of my favorites to talk about the sleep of the dead. And Paul, mixing metaphors, unfortunately, talks about dwellings and clothing, mixing those two together. And so he says, verse 1 of 2 Corinthians 5, for we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So he's beginning to talk about buildings, earthly one, flesh, spiritual body that's coming, 1 Corinthians 15. He says, here indeed we groan, again in the flesh, our physical body we groan, and long to put on our heavenly dwelling, the spiritual body, so that by putting it on, we may not be found naked. And so here is where the analogy of clothed with the physical body, clothed with the spiritual body, and unclothed, naked. So the physical body is now, the spiritual body is later when Christ comes. And so the in-between state, which we would call death, or for some people, theology, disembodied, no body, no tent, physical or spiritual, disembodied state. Paul says, he calls it naked in this discussion. He says, so here indeed we groan in this body and long to put on our heavenly dwelling, so that by putting on the heavenly dwelling, we may not be found naked. So this is the first time in this passage Paul says, I don't want to be naked, in the sense of without a body. Meaning that why wouldn't he want to be? Because that would be with the Lord. Even if he didn't have a body, he would at least be with the Lord in heaven. But he says clearly, I don't want to be found naked or without a body. For while, verse 4, we are still in this tent, earthly body, we sigh with anxiety. Not that we would be unclothed. And so again, second time, even in this body, even though we groan and sigh with anxiety, we're not unclothed. So twice he says, I don't want to be naked, I don't want to be unclothed. Translate that to be, I don't want to be dead. Well, why would Paul say he didn't want to be dead? Because dead is not with the Lord. It's in the grave. So while we are still in this tent, we sigh with anxiety, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. So I want out of this earthly tent, and I want the new tent, but I don't want the intermediate state of dead, unclothed, or naked. So he says, he has prepared for us this very thing in God, who has given us a spirit of a guarantee. And here we get down to the verse. So, verse 6, we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, meaning right now physical, we are away from the Lord. Obviously, we're not living with the Lord right now. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body, now, physical, and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to praise him. So it says to be absent from the body and at home with the Lord. Those are two things. Because in the context, Paul says you can be absent from this physical body and be dead. He says, but I don't want that. What I want is to be absent from this body and not is, but and present with the Lord. In other words, let's skip the intermediate state, which is unclothed, naked, disembodied. Paul doesn't want to be there because if you read this then in the context, to be dead or absent from this body and dead is to not be with the Lord. So we would rather, he says, be away from this body and at home with the Lord. To be naked is to not be with the Lord. So Paul very clearly says, what I want is to skip the intermediate state of death, and I want to be with the Lord. I don't want to die because that's not with God.